Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Vincent and Elkins Power Series CLE. My name is Stephanie Coco, and this is Mark Brasher. We're both partners here in the Houston office with practices focusing on project development in the energy and infrastructure space. So just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. You should see us as well as the presentation in your screen, although your view may be different if you're on a mobile device. You're more than welcome to ask us questions throughout the presentation through the chat function at the bottom of your screen. We'll be collecting those as we go, and we'll try to answer as many of those as we can at the end of the presentation. This is a CLE accredited course, so there will be polling questions that pop up I think 3 different times throughout the presentation, and you'll get notifications about those through the chat function before they come up. So with that, we'll get started.
Thanks, Stephanie, and thanks for joining today. So today we're gonna walk you through the key considerations in planning and contracting for EPC projects for behind the meter power, which is obviously a huge part of our practice and what's going on for a lot of OEMs and contractors in the market at the moment. So just to frame things up before we get into it, we typically represent sponsors and developers, sometimes on the lender side. We're rarely on the contractor side, although occasionally we do act on that side, so we understand that perspective as well. What we've focused these materials on is probably the hardest version of these projects, which is a fully islanded behind the meter power project with project financing. Obviously, some of you on the presentation will be doing other types of behind the meter projects, ones that have grid interconnections and are not as kind of at the single point of failure like fully behind the meter is. So with those projects, there's sometimes more leeway, but I think it's good to consider it from this perspective to really get an idea of where the pressure points are in these projects. Finally, before we get into it, the other thing to consider here is what we're outlining here is best practices for these types of projects, and we're trying to negotiate these things in a very tight market, which means that the contractors are going to be very difficult to negotiate with, and so the kind of practice or theory versus reality is where things can sometimes get difficult. Okay, so what makes behind the meter EPC contracts different and EPC contracting? One of the things that's, I think, important to focus on here is the offtake requirements for data centers are incredibly onerous. They're looking for 5 nines performance most of the time, and that doesn't necessarily line up with the performance frameworks that are typical of turbine supply agreements, EPC contracts for power plants. Typically, there's more give in the performance requirements, and so that what we're seeing in the market is that developers are using design redundancy as a way of getting around that performance pressure, and so projects are being developed with a high percentage of redundancy, additional units that are there as backup, and allow the equipment to have sort of built-in kind of failure, padding for failure. So what's important there is that creates some release from the performance requirements that and the interface between the PPA and the EPC, and that then allows lenders to lend to projects even where the performance guarantees for individual units don't match up to the 99.99% that's required under the PPAs.
Yeah, so when you're thinking about, the various different terms that have to be considered when you're um, sort of coming up with your framework, you're looking at the requirements under your offtake agreement. So, Mark's already touched on the performance guarantees and sort of what you need to be thinking about that there and how you can sort of meld those together. A lot of these projects you're seeing combined sort of gas, battery storage, solar, various different technologies that are being, utilized in a combined project. So you have to sort of think about the integration of those various different technologies and, how they play together. Think about, the interconnections and all of that to make sure that everything is ultimately going to come together in a full package and deliver, a unified working project. And then also, when you're thinking about these multi-technology projects, you know, you're really building sort of a project that, it projects that had sort of historically been done by different contracts separately. So, there's been a lot of solar and BESS development in the US across the past kind of 5 to 10 years. So you have lots of contractors who are used to, delivering those specific projects. But now we're seeing these sort of very large gas power plus BESS and solar. And so you have to be thinking about, the different contractors sort of experience levels with the various types of projects, sort of what their financial strength is, all of those sorts of things. And then layered in on top of that, you sort of think of your EPC contractor, but then you have all these major items of equipment that are coming from what are typically very kind of strong OEMs who have, very established businesses and stronger, financial strength. So, that sort of helps to build out the picture there. So I think if we go to the next slide, then
I can pick this up.
Okay.
Yeah. So what we've typically see in project finance is lump sum turnkey EPC contracting, where a single contractor with good credit is standing in front of the entire performance and wraps it, and that's what most of the lenders we've worked with historically are used to seeing. Now, what we're seeing here, for some of the reasons that Stephanie described, is a lot more multi-prime type contracting, where you'll have multiple equipment packages and sometimes also multiple EPC contractors on the site performing the balance of plant. Now, that's a point of vulnerability from a lender's perspective and a sponsor risk that gets a lot of scrutiny because all of these packages, as they start to get broken apart, carry interface risk between them. But one of the things that makes it a strength is the people with the best credit in the market at the moment are the OEM contractors. And when you have a multi-prime approach, you're facing the OEM contractors directly on things like turbine packages or a battery system. And so that becomes a point of strength. And if you're in a position to negotiate good terms with those suppliers, then that becomes kind of a feature more than a bug of that structure. So multi-prime, we think, is bankable, but it requires a lot of discipline around the contracting approaches to address all of these risks that start to come into view in a multi-prime approach.
Yep. So then this next slide kind of hits all of the key categories of sort of performance and risks that are your typical bankability benchmarks. And so the first item around, the contract structure and the design margin are what we were hitting on the first slide. So, you're looking at the redundancy of the equipment, to be able to enable you to get more traditional performance guarantees under the EPC while still satisfying the more stringent offtake requirements under your offtake agreement. And so you're sort of using the over design to help manage that risk so that the contractors can actually provide you what you need, sort of taking on customary levels of risk and then accordingly sort of more customary pricing levels. Your completion guarantee is sort of your standard schedule consideration, right? Under your various EPC contracts and equipment supply contracts, you will have the performance requirements and the testing requirements to prove that those performance guarantees have been achieved, and there will be certain dates and timing requirements around those things when those things have to be satisfied. Similarly, under the offtake agreements, you will have a guaranteed commencement of service date, and the tie between your suite of construction agreements, delivery dates, and your offtake agreement commencement of service date needs to be well aligned. You want to make sure you have sufficient buffer built in to make sure that, if the EPC is late, you're not automatically in a delay situation under your offtake. So we'll get into the details of all these items a little bit more in further slides, but just to kind of give an overview now. On the liability cap consideration, so what we're typically seeing in the market is sort of a 30 to 50% of the contract price on your aggregate liability cap. Typically, your delay and performance-related LDs are subject to separate subcaps, kind of in the sort of 10 to 15% range on delay, and then more, maybe a little bit bigger on performance. And we like to see those subcaps, carved out of the aggregate liability cap and other, customary carve-outs from the aggregate cap, your third-party indemnities, fraud, willful misconduct, abandonment, those sorts of things, to try to, ensure that there is enough contractor exposure across the full suite of agreements. On the delay piece of it, usually, obviously you're trying to size your delay liquidated damages so that you're covering your debt service and then your carrying cost, sort of at least for 6 months. But it kind of, depends on where all that lands within the LD caps under the respective scopes and whatnot. Obviously, in a lump sum turnkey scenario, as well as in a multi-prime scenario, you're typically working under a fixed price structure, or ideally you're working under a fixed price structure. So change orders are going to be very important. And we'll get into more detail around the considerations there. The change provisions, sort of the give and take on that depends on how your pricing is working under your offtake agreements. If under the offtake agreement, the supplier gets some relief for cost overruns or gets a pass through of cost overruns, that obviously eases the pressure on the sort of fixed price nature of your construction contracts. But if, the power price under your offtake is fixed, then obviously it becomes very, very important to manage your change risk and make sure that the contractors are actually, taking the cost risk, to the maximum extent that it makes sense from a commercial perspective. Your warranties and your O&M coverage are obviously very important. We're typically seeing 1 to 2 year warranty periods, depending on the scope. You want to make sure that warranty is covering the full, it's a robust design, workmanship, materials warranty. And then on your LTSA side, we'll get into more detail on this later, but you have to, it's important to be negotiating those sort of at the same time as your various warranties and making sure you're getting the performance guarantees that you need for the full life of the equipment. And we can go ahead and go to the next slide. We won't spend much time on this slide, but it's just to kind of give you an overview of the potential suite of contracts that we're talking about if you're doing a gas plus BESS plus solar project. So, you would have the equipment supply agreements for your various large items of equipment. So your gas turbines for the gas power. On BESS, you'll have your batteries, solar, your PV modules, inverters, things like that, that are typically or frequently owner-issued equipment. And then you will have your balance of plant EPC contractor who's kind of taking up the rest of the scope and integrating the equipment, installing it, doing sort of everything beyond the equipment supply. We're seeing, depending on, it kind of varies project to project, but you may have, a balance of plant EPC contractor for the gas project, a separate balance of plant EPC contractor for the BESS, and a separate for solar. Sometimes BESS and solar may be under the same EPC. It just kind of depends. But we are seeing a good deal of sort of splitting up of those agreements. And so that's kind of the top row of the chart in the darker blue, which are your construction period contracts. And then at the same time that you're negotiating those contracts, there's the bottom row of agreements, which are your various LTSA and O&M type agreements that need to be taken into consideration as well, and synced up with the requirements under the offtake and sort of the long-term considerations of the project.
Okay, so all of that kind of boils down to really three headline risks that we're trying to manage across the full suite of project documents. So this slide just kind of shows you in simple terms where the terms of the offtake are meeting the EPC terms and what we're trying to manage. So the first headline risk is obviously cost, as Stephanie's already talked about. How much leeway there is in the PPA around cost is directly going to drive the flexibility and bankability of the EPC arrangements. We are seeing that because there's so much schedule pressure to get these projects built and commissioned, that there are opportunities for developers to transfer some of that risk back onto the data center customer in the PPA, which then kind of translates into giving you slightly more flexibility in how you structure your EPC arrangements as to cost, and brings in the things like guaranteed maximum price arrangements and or cost plus arrangements for certain parts of the work, and that can be kind of managed in sync with the terms in the PPA. That's obviously a project by project thing, but it is something to consider when you're putting together the full suite of project documents. The solutions aren't necessarily always just push more risk onto the contractors and suppliers. And as we mentioned at the start, in an extremely tight market, that's very difficult to do as well. So look for those other release points as well in your revenue contracts. Schedule, obviously critical. I would say that here we're going in kind of ascending order of how important these are to the off-takers, and so cost being the one that's least sensitive, schedule's very sensitive. However, there's a kind of push and pull going on in the market, and this has bled over a little bit from practice that we're seeing in the data center context, where lenders and sponsors are pushing very hard against the data center customers having any termination rights for schedule delays, or putting the long stop date so far out that it's really not no longer a risk. So on schedule, if you can negotiate that type of leeway in the PPA, then you have slightly more flexibility in your EPC, which is important because as you think about going from a lump sum turnkey to a multi-prime approach, there's inherently going to be more schedule risk and more opportunity for issues that are not clearly attributable to a single contractor or supplier causing delay. And those are the things that fall back onto the owner. So a lot of the rest of this presentation is going to talk about how to manage those interface risks. And then obviously performance is the last headline risk. This is the one that the customers have very little tolerance for any non-compliance with. So on performance, you should expect strict availability and output requirements. Obviously, emissions is a binary thing, so the projects have to meet their emissions guarantees. That has to be managed across equipment packages, and you need to also think about when with a multi-prime, the remedies for performance are likely to sit mostly in a couple of contracts. So the gas turbine agreement or the BESS supply agreement, and then kind of coupled with those things, the long-term service agreements or O&M arrangements that go with those contracts. And so a lender or a sponsor are going to look at both the construction phase risk as far as performance is concerned and what a project is able to deliver during its final performance tests at the end of construction. But they're also going to look at coverage over the life of the project, and that's where the LTSA and O&M arrangements become very important. And a critical thing for people to bear in mind, because it does get forgotten, and I think a lot of the O&Ms are quite happy for you to forget about it, because when you're negotiating the full suite of construction contracts and supply agreements, that's when you have the most leverage to get the best terms in your LTSA and O&M arrangements. And that means that you'll get the best possible coverage in terms of pricing predictability over a 15-year period for the long-term maintenance of the assets, scheduling of that maintenance. So guaranteed response times with LDs are tied to them. Those sort of things, they're all really important and things that you can typically negotiate from a much stronger position when pre-FID, and then obviously performance and availability guarantees as well. So we just want to make this point we've done multi-prime projects for a long time in other contexts. One thing that I think some developers who are less experienced kind of forget and can get into trouble with is it's really important to have someone very knowledgeable and experienced managing the interface risk between all the contracts. And historically what we've seen is an owner's engineer, like a Bechtel or someone like that, acting in that role, or Jacobs, and even though that's a relatively low value contract in the context of the broader project, it's someone with a good reputation who understands the engineering elements of the project and can be relied upon to look for the gaps between the various scopes and as much as possible minimize that gap risk. And just having that person there with a reputation that's going to be recognized by lenders and sponsors is a very valuable thing. It's going to make your financing efforts, whether it's talking to potential lenders or equity investors, much easier to navigate. So want to get in now a little bit more into the details of the schedule risk problem in multi-prime contracting. So as we've said, lump sum turnkey, it's easy. You have a single point of responsibility. Once you have 3 or 4 major equipment packages, 2 or 3 different contractors operating on site, it becomes a much muddier picture. So there are various things that you can do to manage this. You can't eliminate the risk that one contractor is going to do something that's going to have a rippling effect through all the other contracts, and that your recourse against that contractor is not going to be adequate. But you can certainly give yourself the best chance of having recourse if that happens. So looking at the solutions here, one of the things we push really hard for with OEMs, and the reason why this is so important is because that's where the majority of the CapEx is in buying these turbines and batteries and solar panels. And so we push very hard for what we refer to as springing liquidated damages. So what that is the OEMs typically try to stop the clock on their delay liquidated damages exposure on delivery of the equipment. But then you have a whole nother period for the installation, commissioning and testing period where it's extremely possible that their equipment could be the cause of a delay, whether that's a defect in the equipment or failure of a performance test that has to be run 2 or 3 more times after remedying in between tests. So all of those things can result in a delay in getting to COD and stopping your schedule exposure under the PPA. So what we try to do, and with a decent amount of success, but it's always a negotiation, is draft provisions into these contracts that have the liquidated damages spring back into effect if an OEM is the cause of a delay during commissioning and testing. We also, just to keep in mind, I know we had on the traditional bankability slide liquidated damage amounts. You obviously have to remember that each individual package is a fraction of the total cost. So the LD amounts that you should be pushing for with OEMs should typically be slightly higher, and the liability caps. And obviously it's a tight market, so you've got to kind of see what you get. But I think as a general rule, if you're looking at a big turbine package or the battery system, you want to be pushing for 20% or so of delay LDs, 20% or so of performance LDs, and then maybe a cumulative cap of LDs that's slightly less than that. The third solution, which I obviously mentioned on the last slide, is having the owner's engineer type role, looking for someone who can play that role, whether that's if you're in a big organisation, maybe you have that kind of covered internally, but otherwise pulling someone in externally is a big benefit to the project. And then, as I mentioned previously, there is a push to kind of relieve some of this schedule pressure by having data center customers give up at least their right to terminate due to delays, and therefore then it becomes a slightly easier issue to manage, because you're really just looking at the LD exposure, and the lenders will look at what you can get from the equipment suppliers and contractors, and then contingent equity sort of covers the gap. This is kind of showing what I spoke about just now in a slightly different layout, but this is the sequence from equipment delivery through to full testing, and again, we've just outlined there some of the key risks that we're trying to cover for in these springy LD arrangements. And so they're the kind of things when you're drafting these provisions that you want to come back to and make sure that the language captures so that the springing LD is actually triggered.
Okay, so then obviously in every construction, equipment supply, delivery type contract, the change order provision and then the force majeure provision are highly negotiated, since these are the mechanics through which the various different contractors and suppliers are able to get cost and schedule relief. So if you're in a fully wrapped lump sum turnkey EPC type situation, then you're negotiating the set of change events with a single contractor, and you're taking into consideration maybe what events may entitle you to relief under your offtake contract that may be limited to just force majeure. But you basically have two agreements that you're looking to sort of align and make sure they're consistent, and that the developer isn't bearing a lot of gap risk. When you switch to a multi-prime approach, you then have many contracts that you're negotiating, change provisions and FM provisions within, and you have to be very careful to sort of maintain consistency, and also bear in mind, in a multi-prime approach, delay, for example, by the turbine supplier in delivering the turbines for the balance of plant EPC contractor to receive is an event that would entitle the BOP EPC to relief. So you have that whole added addition of the interplay there between, if one contractor is late, then it entitles a subsequent contractor to relief. So as you're negotiating, the list of change events, ideally from a developer perspective, the list of events would be limited to, owner-directed change orders. If you change the scope, have a design change, that sort of thing. FM changes in law, and, depending on what the scope is. So maybe for your balance of plant EPC contractor, differing site conditions, those sorts of things. Obviously, as we've said, it's a pretty contractor favorable market right now, as far as there's a lot of work and a lot of competition. So we're seeing contractors pushing a lot on what the change events are and trying to negotiate pretty aggressive change events. Also, there's a good deal of uncertainty in the world as it relates to, tariffs and various war events that are causing supply issues and whatnot. So that creates a lot of uncertainty that, the parties have to figure out how to address. And so with, things like changes in tariffs, because there has been so much variability and so many changes to that over the past, year and a half, however long it's been, where we've kind of seen that issue landing for the most part is that, it doesn't necessarily make sense for a contractor to price in the risk associated with changes in tariffs, because since there has been so much variability, they would build in a very large contingency buffer, to protect against the risk. So we're seeing on those, the tariff issues, things get priced kind of at the existing tariff rate as of signing, and then there's just, a pass through up or down based on where tariffs actually are at the time the tariffs are assessed. And we try to negotiate in various different mechanics to help protect the developer in those situations. So requirements for the contractor to use, commercially reasonable efforts to minimize the tariff impact, requirements for them to, if tariffs that have already been paid get lifted, requirements for them to seek recovery and refund those to the owner, those sorts of just procedural type things to try to ensure that the tariff impact is getting minimized. So, and then sort of as it relates to force majeure, you need to be very careful that the force majeure definitions are it's consistent across the full suite of agreements, including your offtake, and then also sort of making sure that you sort of have qualities of events that that would qualify as force majeure. So, it's an event that's beyond the reasonable control of the affected party. It's, not possible to prevent or mitigate with commercially reasonable efforts. There's an adverse effect on the party's ability to perform. And it's sort of not resulting from any act or event of the affected party. So you want to have all those parameters built in, and then you want to specifically exclude certain events. So for example, supply chain disruptions. Sometimes you'll see contractors and suppliers just try to put in this very broad, event that is basically if their supply chain is impacted by anything that's beyond their control, they're entitled to FM relief. And same with labor shortages. And so you just have to be really careful to push back on those things. And, because there may be supply chain impacts, and if it's truly from what you would think of as a more traditional event of force majeure, fine, that's fair if it truly is beyond the control. But if it's just a function of managing your supply chain and it's a tight market and, it's very competitive to get the materials or whatnot, whatever it may be that the contractor needs, then that's obviously not something that should be considered FM. So just things to be aware of there. And then obviously sort of the cascading effect of all that. And this impacts, it impacts your price as well as your schedule. So then moving on, we've been hitting on this sort of throughout the presentation, but in this multi-contract approach, you have to sort of zoom out and look at your various remedies across the full suite of agreements. So with respect to delay, you have to be looking at each and every one of your contracts to make sure the milestones are consistent. The developer has very clear remedies that they can enforce. Ideally, with respect to delay, remedy, that you're getting progress reports and you have very good visibility into how the work is progressing so that you can be putting pressure on the contractor sort of as you go if you start to see any delay accumulating to try to keep things on track so that the overall project schedule is maintained. And you can do that, by building in reporting requirements that if a certain level of delay occurs, the contractor has to provide a recovery plan, those sorts of things. And then it's sort of the same thing with performance shortfalls, as Mark mentioned earlier. It'll probably be one or two main contracts where your performance is coming into play around, performance guarantees and equipment that contributes to the performance. So, the way that we're seeing people mostly manage that is through the design redundancy, because sort of given the aggregate size of the project, you push as hard as you can to get your LD caps at the level that they kind of need to be from a dollar value perspective. But by virtue of the fact that these things, in a scenario where you are taking a multi-contractor approach, then, it can be hard to push sort of the economic risk on an individual contractor if they don't have sort of the corresponding level of economic benefit. So you kind of have to manage that as best as you can, get the LDs sort of as high as you can and still get, commercial pricing and terms, but sort of design around and have redundant systems to help you on the performance side of things.
Stephanie, we've just had a question from someone asking, how do we recommend accounting for collateral delays in liquidated damages, meaning a delay caused to an interdependent downstream scope? So I think that kind of relates to this. A couple of things on that. I mean, first of all, you want to be setting up LD milestones that hit the pressure points throughout the schedule. So that you could have LDs tied to delivery of engineering drawings that another contractor needs, or delivery of parts and equipment, or handover. So things that are not necessarily going to affect the end date immediately, but would have an immediate effect on other contractors. And in that context, those LDs are intended to cover some of that knock-on or collateral impact throughout the rest of the chain. I think, a couple of other things that can help protect against that are having good interface and coordination language in the contract, and acknowledgements from contractors, particularly the ones working on site, that they are going to be working in an environment where multiple contractors are going to be active. And so trying to sort of cut off these claims of nuisance or interference where it's actually just baked into the execution plan. And then finally, and these are kind of difficult points to negotiate, but you need to at least start pushing for them, is making sure that schedule relief granted to contractors and any corresponding cost relief tied to critical path delays to achievement of the absolute end date. So trying to get the float in the construction schedule to be owned and managed by the owner, as opposed to belonging to individual contractors. And that's sort of the bag of tricks. I don't think you can fully mitigate that risk, but using that combination of things gives you at least a chance to minimise the damage when there is a major delay impact.
Okay, so moving on to credit and credit security. If you were looking at sort of the gold standard project, you would want a lump sum turnkey EPC contract that's supported by a letter of credit and a parent guarantee from the contractor. But sort of, what we see is, developers go out asking for letters of credit. Every contractor sort of hates the idea of having to provide a letter of credit. So then it becomes a situation where you're faced with a letter of credit versus, the contractor is always going to say, oh, we'll give you a bond. Well, the difference between a letter of credit and a bond is an LC is a very liquid instrument that, you can take to the bank and get cash to then sort of utilize to, do whatever the contractor hasn't done that's entitled you to the draw. Whereas a bond is really more of an insurance product. And so what you're really getting there is an insurer stepping in to then sort of complete the performance of the project. So they're two very different instruments and provide a very different sort of level of support. Lenders obviously much prefer letters of credit. And so ideally you would have a letter of credit with a value of 10 to 15% of the contract price, and that sort of gets stepped down at substantial completion by a negotiated amount. But, I think sort of standalone, if you're doing solar projects, BESS projects, sort of outside of this larger gas plus solar plus BESS context, that set of contractors that typically do those projects is very accustomed to, providing bonds and parent guarantees. And so they sort of meet the letter of credit requirement with a lot of resistance. And frequently, just aren't willing to post them. So we do see those contractors who have been sort of used to operating in that space having very strong feelings against the letters of credit and wanting the bonds. So it's something that you kind of have to work through. It also depends, obviously, on who the contractor is, who you're dealing with. Are you dealing with, a consortium of contractors? What is their credit rating? Lenders are going to be looking at the financial statements of those parties, whether or not they're rated, what their balance sheets look like. All of these contractors right now are, taking on a lot of work and a lot of large dollar value work. So this will definitely be a point of heightened consideration from the lenders and sort of considering, what the financial health of your counterparties are. In the multi-contractor approach, one thing that does help with that is, you will have your equipment supply contracts in place directly with the various different suppliers. And most of those suppliers are very credit worthy and have strong credit profiles. So that obviously helps and mitigates some of the exposure, as opposed to being in a situation with, the EPC contractor wrapping it all and maybe not having, the credit wherewithal to do that. So that is one area where the multi-prime does help you out, and relieves a little bit of that pressure. Okay, I'm not going to touch too much on indemnities. The key takeaway here is, when you're in a multi-prime structure, you obviously need to make sure that all of your indemnities are consistent across the full suite of agreements so that you don't have any gaps where the owner is covering that gap. On insurance, in this multi-contractor approach, we're seeing a lot of owner-controlled insurance programs in play, and the lenders wanting that to be in play. And what that basically is it's a consolidated insurance program that the owner puts in place, and each prime and all of their, most of their subs sign up and they enroll under that insurance program, and it provides sort of your standard coverage for CGL, workers' comp, builders all risk, excess liability, professional services coverage, pollution, those sorts of things. And the parties all share the same limits, and those limits are higher than they would be if each individual contractor was placing the coverage typically. So it gives you kind of this umbrella policy over your full project, and create sort of, uniform administration and claims procedures and all those sorts of things, and helps get rid of, gaps in coverage to make sure that, the full project is covered.
And that's also important for being able to trigger delay in startup coverage based on events across the full kind of performance framework. Mm-hmm. So obviously if you start splitting up the insurance, that becomes much more difficult. And given a lot of these challenges we've discussed today, things like delay in startup insurance and then during operation business interruption insurance are obviously critical to bankability. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, I want to try to save a little bit of time at the end for questions. So this is an area that I probably very few people on this call want to deal with, but it's kind of unavoidable in this context. So for any project, lenders are going to be looking for assurance that the owner has sufficient IP rights and software rights to be able to complete the project and then continue to operate the facility for its full life, or the life of the offtake contract, even if things go badly wrong with the contractor or a supplier. So, whether they exit or the contract gets terminated, they become insolvent, they discontinue a business line, all of those things are possible over the long lifespans of these projects that we're considering. So it's important to give this the attention it deserves. Make sure you're getting IP license grants that are sufficiently broad to cover the full spectrum of project activities, and making sure they survive a termination or a bankruptcy. confidentiality rights kind of go hand in hand with the IP rights, and you need to make sure that they're also going to be sufficiently broad so that if you do have to bring in a replacement solution, you're going to be able to do that. We're seeing for some very high value equipment purchases that have sophisticated control systems built into them, the owners requesting escrow of source code is something that we see, and some lenders asking for that. That's hard to negotiate, but it's worth pushing for. And a fallback could be an end user license agreement, but ultimately you kind of need to get your hands on all the source code if you're going to be able to operate and troubleshoot if things go off the rails with the contractor or supplier. Data ownership, software licenses, they're all critical points. And then the last point I'd make is there's a real risk of boundary disputes around IP when you're taking a multi-prime approach. So we have multiple OEMs, all with proprietary equipment whose equipment is then being integrated with other systems. And so the question of who owns improvements on the edges where the fields of use potentially overlap is a really difficult one. So it's important to not glaze over the IP provisions and make sure you're reading them and then aligning them across the full suite of documents so that you're not going to get into trouble with agreeing to something with one party that's completely at odds with what you've agreed with another. We've made this point already. Important to negotiate the LTSA and O&M arrangements with the OEMs at the same time as you purchase the equipment. These are some of the things to focus on in that negotiation. So it's important to look at the scope of the services. These are very kind of technical contracts in terms of what's covered and what's excluded, and what's in and out of the scope here has a big impact on your operating costs, and so it needs to be really carefully considered. Things like availability guarantees, the intervals for scheduled maintenance, all of those are going to play into your ability to meet 5 nines performance under your offtake arrangement. And then the fee structure, typically there'll be some elements of an LTSA that are fixed and with escalation, and then others that are variable. Again, really important to scrutinise those so that you fully understand what to put into your model so that you can match the operating costs to the revenue picture. And so, and then a couple of other things to think about on the right-hand side in terms of major risks. So I'm just going to see if there's any other questions. We've included a couple of slides at the end here that kind of give us an overview of what we've already talked about. Offtake, driving flexibility you have in how you structure the rest of the arrangements, and that kind of going into the bankability picture. I'm just going to look at the questions to try to see if we can hit some of those before we finish. There's a question here. Can we talk a bit about how negotiation of gas supply contracts fits into the overall process from a timing standpoint, and what a typical contract looks like from a tenure and pricing structure standpoint? So I think that's, I suppose, a little bit outside of the EPC topic, but it's an important piece, right? Because you need to manage the gas supply and ensure that it's going to be there when you need to start commissioning. And if the gas isn't there, then you're going to start to incur delay costs with your contractors, and you're going to be exposed under the offtake. So typically, these projects, most of the fully islanded projects are being located nearby to a major pipeline, and so you actually have to kind of pull together a suite of contracts around the gas supply to get it there. So a precedent agreement with the pipeline. You'll need someone to build the lateral that ties into the facility. Obviously, the timing of that work needs to be aligned with the timing of the broader EPC arrangements, so both at the front end and the back end. So typically we'd see those arrangements negotiated with conditions precedent in them. So if you can get the midstream company to agree to guarantee the terms on the construction of the lateral, and then hold that during a period for you to satisfy the rest of the conditions precedent on the project, that's important. And then obviously the gas supply, long-term NASBs with confirmations for long-term gas supply. What we're seeing people start to go out there and negotiate.
Yeah, and we have started seeing to some developers, kind of being worried about this issue and wanting to make sure they can have a lateral in place, and they're negotiating these sort of cost reimbursement, early works type agreements to start, whether it's the design work or the right-of-way work or whatever it may be for that pipe, to try to preserve the schedule of the overall project and keep that piece moving if they're not quite ready to negotiate the full precedent agreement and get all of that in place as sort of a schedule preservation effort.
And then there's another question here. Have you seen price floor guarantees in offtake arrangements? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I mean, one thing to say about the offtake is that the structure can be quite variable. It depends on the jurisdiction that you're in and the rules around utility regulation as to exactly how you can structure offtake. And a lot of these, I know we've been referring generically to these as PPA, but a lot of these agreements are actually structured more like a toll, so and sometimes referred to as kind of equipment leases, where the data center customer is responsible for the gas supply and then tolls it through the facility, and so that's kind of a very different structure. And obviously in that structure you're moving the gas pricing risk onto the customer, and then you're left with very much a kind of fixed price model for the leasing or tolling of the facility. So it depends a lot on the offtake structure. And then last question we have here is, are there any specifics we need to account for regarding permits? I mean, it's this is a difficult one, right? In a lump sum turnkey contract, we want to push as much permitting risk onto the contractors as possible. It's a lot harder when the owner's managing the whole thing. And then the question asked specifically about federal environmental permits. I mean, I suppose what you need to account for is that as well as emissions and air permitting are critical to the success of these projects. They're the things that people start working on, I would say, earliest, and they're going to be essential to taking FID. So in the context of what we've talked about today, trying to pull these projects together and kind of get everything to the finish line where you have valid contracts across the board, still at the point where you have all your permits and your financing lined up. I think the main consideration is to know that that's a risk, know that you have specialists managing that, and then to the extent you need conditions precedent in these contracts as you pull everything together and kind of push it towards a final investment decision or financial close, having CPs that specifically address these risks and the contingencies around them, I think is probably the best thing you can do within these contracts to manage the risk. So on the last slide, we've got key takeaways. I think we talked about all of these. We'll share the slides after the presentation. So thank you everyone for watching the presentation today. And if anyone has follow-up questions, we'd be happy to answer them. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thanks.